Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Thank you for coming and thank you for gracing us with your presence on this day. My name is Zoe Lafis. I am a member of the board of Prometheas, and it is my pleasure to present today's program dedicated to the commemoration of the 25th of March and Greek Independence Day. We begin in honor of our two beloved countries with the Greek national anthem and the American anthem performed by Elena Iliadis. And we continue in honor of the blessed day of March 25th with a kontakion to the Theotokos, ti Hypermachou, performed by Mr. George Theodoridis, Protopsaltis of Saint Sophia Greek Orthodox Cathedral.
Σε γνωρίζω από την κόψη του σπαθιού την τρομερή. Σε γνωρίζω από την όψη που με διαμετράει τη γη. Απ' τα κόκαλα βγαμένη των Ελλήνων τα ιερά και σαν πρώτα ανδριωμένη χέρω-χέρ ελευθεριά και σαν πρώτα ανδριωμένη χέρω-χέρ ελευθεριά και σαν πρώτα ανδριωμένη χέρω-χέρ ελευθεριά. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Στρατηγό τα νικητήρια, ως λυτρωθήσα των δίνων ευχαριστήρια, αναγράφωση η πόλη σου Θεοτόκε, άλλος έχουσα το κράτος απροσμάχητον εκ παντίον με κινδύνων ελευθερώσον. Ειν ακράζωση χαίρε νύμφη ανυμφεύτε.
It is with distinct pleasure that we welcome Mr. Periklis Tabekis, President of the Hellenic Society of Prometheas and a valued member of our community.
Good evening. I'm Pericles Tabakis. I'm the president of the Hellenic Society Prometheus. On behalf of Prometheus and the co-sponsoring organizations, I welcome you to this virtual celebration of the 201st anniversary of the declaration of the Greek War of Independence. In the bejeweled pantheon of Greek history, the 25th of March of 1821 is among the brightest. The revolution led to the formation of the modern Greek state, and its heroes proved worthy descendants of those who graced the pages of our long history. The national poet Dionysius Solomos put it best in one of the verses of the Greek national anthem. «Ω τρακόσι, σηκωθείτε και ξανάρθετε σε μας. Τα παιδιά σας θέλει δείτε πόσο μοιάζουνε με σας». The memory of this war and the rebirth of the Greek nation is a source of pride and inspiration and an exemplar of the love of freedom, of bravery and sacrifice. This is particularly true for the Greeks of diaspora, for it was that group that sowed the seeds which fueled the revolution. So today, let us rededicate ourselves to those high ideals of Hellenism and help make our world worthy of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stavakis. We continue with a greeting by His Excellency, Secretary General for Public Diplomacy and Greeks Abroad, Professor Ioannis Chrysoulakis.
Αγαπητοί συμπατριώτες, Ελληνίδες και Έλληνες σε κάθε γωνιά του πλανήτη. Το 2021 γιορτάσαμε με πανηγυρικό τρόπο το ορόσημο των 200 χρόνων από την Ελληνική Επανάσταση, η οποία οδήγησε στη συγκρότηση του σύγχρονου ελληνικού κράτους. Χάρη στις εκδηλώσεις που διοργανώθηκαν σε ολόκληρο τον κόσμο, με τη συμμετοχή του απόδημου ελληνισμού, το οικουμενικό μήνυμα της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης έλαψε παντού, ως σύγχρονη φρικτορία. Γιορτάζουμε και φέτος την επέτειο της 25ης Μαρτίου ως ορόσημο για το παρελθόν, αλλά και ως φάρο για το παρόν και το μέλλον του απανταχού ελληνισμού. Σε μια περίοδο ταραγμένη, μια περίοδο αυξημένης αστάθειας και πρωτοφανών παγκοσμίων εξελίξεων. Υπό αυτό το πρίσμα και περισσότερο από ποτέ, το διαχρονικό μήνυμα της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης αφορά στις κοινές μας αξίες, τις αξίες του σύγχρονου κόσμου. Αφορά στη μάχη τόσο για την ελευθερία και ανεξαρτησία κάθε έθνους, όσο και για το σεβασμό απέναντι στον ίδιο τον άνθρωπο, για τη διάσωση και συνέχιση αυτής καθεαυτής της ανθρωπιστικής μας κουλτούρας. Όπως έγραψε ο μεγάλος μας ποιητής Γιώργος Σεφέρης, μιλώντας για τον Μακρυγιάννη, δεν πρέπει να το ξεχνούμε. Κάθε φορά που η φυλή μας γυρίζει προς το λαό, ζητά να φωτιστεί από το λαό, αναμορφώνεται από το λαό, συνεχίζει την παράδοση που μπήκε θριαμβευτικά στη συνείδηση του έθνους με την Ελληνική Επανάσταση. Ο αγώνας εκείνος ήταν ένα κοινωνικό, πολεμικό και πολιτικό γεγονός. Ήταν συνάμα και ένα πνευματικό γεγονός. Ως παραλήπτες του μηνύματος της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης έχουμε την ελάχιστη υποχρέωση να το διατηρήσουμε και να το μεταδώσουμε. Η ιστορική μνήμη οφείλει να λειτουργήσει ως πηγή έμπνευσης και οράματος. Το μήνυμα αυτό να αποτελέσει σταθερή αφετηρία για το θρίαμβο της ενότητας, της συνεργασίας και της αλληλεγγύης, για το μέλλον της πατρίδας μας, των απανταχού Ελληνίδων και Ελλήνων, αλλά και ως πηξίδα για το κοινό μέλλον της ανθρωπότητας και του σύγχρονου πολιτισμού μας. Ας γιορτάσουμε λοιπόν όλοι μαζί και φέτος, οι απανταχού Ελληνίδες και Έλληνες της ομογένειας, της ελληνικής διασποράς, αλλά και οι απανταχού φίλοι της Ελλάδος, με αίσθημα εθνικής υπερηφάνειας, την εθνική μας επέτειο της έναρξης της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης και τον Ευαγγελισμό της Θεοτόκου. Ας οραματιστούμε από κοινού το μέλλον μας, το μέλλον της πατρίδας μας, το μέλλον της ανθρωπότητας. Ας προτάξουμε το διαχρονικό μήνυμα της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης, ένα μήνυμα διαφωτισμού, και ας συνεχίσουμε να αγωνιζόμαστε με οδηγό μας το φως της δημοκρατίας απέναντι στο σκοτάδι της μυσαλλοδοξίας. Χρόνια πολλά σε όλες και σε όλους.
And now, it is my distinct honor to present to you our keynote speaker today, Mr. Paul Glastris. Mr. Glastris is editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly Magazine. He was previously a correspondent in the Midwest and Europe for U.S. News and World Report, where he covered the war in Bosnia and reported from Russia, Greece, Germany, Turkey, and India. He has also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications, and has been a guest commentator on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and the BBC. He is co-author and editor of two previous books, The Other College Guide and Elephant in the Room, Washington in the Bush Years. Currently, Mr. Glastris is writing a book on Americans' involvement in the Greek War of Independence, which we are looking forward to seeing published soon. Today, Mr. Glastris will speak to us about the American effort to assist the Greek War of Independence and its connection to current events. Dear Mr. Glastris, welcome to this gathering. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Perry Stavekis, the Hellenic Society Prometheus, the other organizations that are a part of this evening, many of which I've been associated with over the years: St. Sophia, St. George, the National Hellenic Society, the Hellenic American Women's Council, and other organizations I probably should be a part of, including the Macedonian Association, considering my mother's father is from Kozani, and I have close cousins there. Thank you for inviting me. The title of my talk this evening is The American Effort to Assist the Greek War of Independence and its connection to current events. Given the state of our world at this moment, I do not have to strain to make that connection. As I speak, a brutal war is taking place in Ukraine, including in cities on the Black Sea coast that were originally founded by, and to some extent are still inhabited by, Greeks. It is a war that pits a nation united by a thirst for independence, democracy, and connection to the West against a brutal, tyrannical regime that has long dominated it. It is a struggle that has captured the hearts of freedom-loving citizens throughout the world and has presented their leaders with exceedingly difficult choices. Should they do everything in their power to aid the brave Ukrainians at the risk of provoking a wider war with a nuclear-armed Russia? Or should they limit their country's involvement at the risk of depriving Ukraine of the arms and other assistance it needs to survive as an independent country? 201 years ago, almost to the day, a war similarly pitting liberalism and tyranny broke out in areas not too far from the current conflict. In what is now Romania and Moldova, bordering Ukraine, and in the Peloponnese, Greek-speaking Christians began an armed uprising to liberate themselves from the Muslim Ottoman Turks who had ruled them for nearly 4 centuries. Then, as now, the war captured the sympathies of average citizens throughout the Western world, and especially in America. They rooted for the underdog Greeks and pressed their leaders to provide the rebels with military and other aid. Then, as now, those leaders wrestled with what to do. Should they give in to popular sentiment and their own hearts and support the Greek revolutionaries at the risk of provoking hostilities with authoritarian regimes then dominating Europe and lucrative trade with the Ottoman Empire? Or should they limit their involvement at the risk of depriving the Greeks of the arms and assistance they needed to survive as an independent country? Indeed, the Greek War of Independence was the first real example of what has become one of the central tensions of American statecraft, one that we're living with today, between the need to make cold-blooded decisions to protect US interests and the belief, strongly held in many quarters, that the United States should also defend and advance democracy and human rights beyond its borders. America in 1821 was a nation feeling its oats. It had recently concluded the War of 1812 on terms that it thought of as a victory, and with its borders and Republican government intact. It had also soundly defeated the Barbary pirates of North Africa, Muslim Ottoman statelets that had been harassing American merchant ships, capturing and enslaving their crews, and demanding ransom and tribute. That military success was also keenly felt. Memoirs, real and fictional, of Americans who had escaped Turkish captivity were bestsellers at the time. And the victory still resounds today in the reference to, quote, the shores of Tripoli, end quote, in the opening line of the Marine hymn. The US population was also expanding west and south, defying the territorial claims of Britain and Spain. The sense that the United States was destined to become a continent-striding power based not on European-style monarchy and oppressive state religions, but on individual political and religious liberty was palpable and electrifying. But so too was the fear that rising authoritarian threats posed danger to that democratic advance. The European powers had recently come together at the Congress of Vienna to reestablish the monarchies that Napoleon had overthrown. Their militaries were crushing democratic uprisings in Spain, Portugal, and Italy, and threatening to do so to independence movements in Latin America. It was in that environment that President James Monroe articulated a foreign policy doctrine, mostly written by his Secretary of State and White House successor, John Quincy Adams, that today bears his name. The Monroe Doctrine declared that the United States would consider any attempt by a European state to oppress or control any country in the Western Hemisphere as a hostile act. It was intended as a warning to the colonial powers not to restrict the potential spread of democracy in Central and South America, nor press any claims on North American territory, thereby clearing the way for US westward expansion. The doctrine also stated that in return, the United States would not involve itself in the affairs of Europe, a vow meant to protect the ability of American merchants to trade freely and on an equal footing without being caught up in Europe's endless commercial intrigues. But just as Monroe and Jackson were formulating their new policy, an unexpected event occurred that complicated their plans. The Greeks launched their insurrection against the Ottoman Turkish overlords and declared the creation of an independent Greek state, democratic Greek state. The Greek rebels were under no illusion about what they had set in motion. They had defied the Ottoman Empire, one of the world's great powers. To survive, they needed the assistance of other great powers. There was, at the time on Earth, however, only one other country that had been born of any monarchical insurrection and had succeeded in setting up the kind of republican government that the leaders of the Greek Revolution, in their better moments, imagined themselves to be creating. That was the United States of America. And so, in addition to sending diplomatic entreaties to England, France, and Russia, the first government of Free Greece, the Messenian Senate, on May the 25th, 1821, drafted a letter to U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, asking for American support for the Greek cause. The letter, a masterpiece of calculated flattery, begins as follows. Free citizens of the United States, having deliberately resolved to live or die for freedom, we are drawn by an irresistible sympathy to the people of the United States, since it is in your land that liberty has fixed her abode, and by you that it is prized as by our fathers. Hence, in invoking her name, we invoke yours at the same time, trusting that in imitating you, we shall imitate our ancestors and be thought worthy of them if we succeed in resembling you. The letter was sent to America via the US ambassador to France, Albert Gallatin, a former Treasury Secretary under Thomas Jefferson, whose statue today stands before the US Treasury building facing Pennsylvania Avenue. Gallatin was, like Jefferson and so many educated liberal men of the day, a deep admirer of ancient Greeks. On the 4th of July, 1821, Gallatin hosted a dinner for like-minded Americans, expats, and friends in Paris, including the writer Washington Irving and the Revolutionary War hero General Lafayette, at which a toast to the Greek Revolution was made. After returning from dinner, US diplomat and classical scholar George Bancroft wrote in his diary of the Greek Revolution, quote, "Since the days of the American War of Independence, there has been no scene of exertion so pure and glorious as this," end quote. News of the Greek Revolution and of the letter from the Messenian Senate soon made it into newspapers across America, as did reports of the brutal response of the Turkish Sultan, Mahmud II. The Sultan's troops quickly crushed the revolt in Romania, led by Alexander Ypsilanti, an aide-de-camp to Tsar Alexander of Russia. Then, to send a message of toughness, Mahmud ordered Patriarch Gregorios, the spiritual leader of all Greek Orthodox Christians, to be hanged. Old and frail, Gregorios, a native of the Peloponnese, was strung up at noon on Easter Sunday, the holiest day of the Orthodox year, from the back door of his own patriarchate in Constantinople. Quote, "His person, attenuated by abstinence and emaciated by age, had not the weight sufficient to cause immediate death," end quote, wrote an English chaplain living in Constantinople. Quote, "He continued for a long time in pain, which no friendly hand dared to abridge, and the darkness of night came before his last convulsions were over," end quote. Pressure, understandably, quickly grew in the press and Congress for the United States to recognize the new Greek government and support its war of independence. The public support for the Greek cause was partly out of religious prejudice. Honestly, the Turks were Muslims, and their oppression of Greeks, including massacres of the innocent, were widely reported in the American press. Greek slaughter of innocent Turks, much less so. But it was also because the educated classes in the West had become obsessed with the glories of classical Greece, as a result of the greater availability of ancient Greek texts, including in translation. The idea that the modern Greeks might throw off tyranny and rebuild the virtuous, self-governing civilization of their ancestors fired the imagination of Westerners with Republican sympathies. Most notably, Lord Byron, the English romantic whose wildly popular poetry gave voice to the idea and who would later die in Greece organizing fighters. It acquired a name, Philhellenism, a Greek word meaning love of Greece. Philhellenism was especially strong in the United States. As citizens of the world's lone republic, Americans had come to see themselves as inheritors of Greek democracy. The spread of Greek revival architecture and the naming of American towns after Greek ones, Syracuse, New York, Athens, Georgia, give you a sense of how culturally potent this sentiment was at the time. Monroe himself had some sympathy for the idea of formally supporting the Greek Revolution, a position he knew was popular with American voters. So too did his Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, and Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, both of whom were eyeing runs for the presidency in the next election. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, however, who was also contemplating a White House bid, believed otherwise. Not only would formally siding with the Greeks contradict the promise of neutrality that was central to Adams' strategy toward Europe, it would also undermine his efforts to secure a trade treaty with the Ottoman Empire. Quote, "Their enthusiasm for the Greeks is all sentiment," end quote, Adams privately wrote of his Philhellenic rivals. That sentiment, however, was widely shared by many of the country's most revered elder statesmen. Former President James Madison proposed that Monroe enlist England in a joint statement in support of the Greek War. Thomas Jefferson sent the leading Greek revolutionary thinker of the time, Adamantios Korais, whom Jefferson had gotten to know in France when he was the US ambassador there, offering advice on how to structure the new Greek government on American principles, though cautioning his old friend against expecting US support. Even John Quincy Adams' own father, former President John Adams, confided to Jefferson, quote, "My old imagination is kindling into a kind of missionary enthusiasm for the Greek cause," end quote. But in the end, Monroe sided with the younger Adams that neutrality was the safer course. When Monroe finally delivered his doctrine publicly in his 1823 State of the Union address, he proclaimed his faith that the Greeks would free themselves, but did not endorse formally recognizing the new Greek government. Philhellenes in Congress, led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, countered with a proposal expressing disapproval of the president's neutral position, while encouraging him to send an agent to Greece to collect information. In the days-long debate that followed, Webster made what might be the earliest and is certainly one of the most masterful congressional speeches ever delivered on the need for the US to stand for democracy and human rights in its foreign policy, asking, quote, "Is it not a duty imposed on us to give our weight to the side of liberty and justice," unquote. He also argued that as a practical matter, the views of average citizens needed to be taken into account in charting America's foreign policy, as, quote, "the public opinion of the civilized world is rapidly gaining an ascendancy over brute force," end quote. In the end, however, Congress adjourned without voting on the proposal. But Webster turned out to be at least partially right about the power of public opinion. After the federal government decided not to get involved in the Greek War of Independence, the American public chose to do so directly. In cities and towns all over the country, citizens banded together to raise money for the Greek war effort, from fancy balls for the elite in Boston to collection plates at Methodist churches in the Midwest. Soon, ships laden with weapons and other supplies were leaving New York and Boston on their way to Piraeus, Nafplion, and other Greek ports. Some assistance was even more direct. Over the 8-year course of the war, more than a dozen Americans went to Greece to fight as volunteers. One of those was George Jarvis. The son of a New York merchant living in Altoona, then part of Denmark, Jarvis left his home at age 24 on November 6, 1821, armed with pistols, cash, letters of introduction from his father, and a certification of his American citizenship, the functional equivalent in those days of a passport. He trekked by foot across Germany, Switzerland, and France to Marseille, where he caught a ship to Greece. Within weeks of his arrival, he was dining with the new Greek president, Alexander Mavrokordatos. Quote, "He liked me the more," he said, "for being an American," end quote, Jarvis wrote in his journal. And he was serving alongside Greek soldiers, laying siege to Turks barricaded inside the Acropolis of Athens. Quote, "We were very near, at pistol shot, and several balls passed very near me and sang by my ears, end quote, writes Jarvis of his first taste of battle. A dozen other Americans are among the hundreds of foreigners who flooded into Greece to fight as volunteers. They included the Boston physician, Samuel Gridley Howe, who would become one of America's most celebrated humanitarians, an Army officer and classics student, Jonathan Peckham Miller, whose bravery in Greece earned him the nickname Yankee Daredevil, a quarrelsome and conspiratorial cousin of George Washington's, William T. Washington, and a Black American cook from Baltimore, James Williams, wounded during brave service in the Battle of the Gulf of Lepanto. In an age when few newspapers had foreign correspondents, it was the letters and dispatches of these men, widely reprinted in American newspapers, that helped keep the American public informed about the course of the war. Much of what they wrote was vivid, informative, insightful, and charming. They were participants in many of the war's key battles. Unlike most European Philhellenes and fighters, they learned the Greek language. They wore the fustanella, and they earned the trust of the leading Greek politicians and military leaders. Jarvis was at different times personal secretary to the war's great Greek general, Theodore Kolokotronis, and commander of Lord Byron's artillery unit. And in the darkest days toward the end of the war, when the combined ravages of the Turkish and Greek militaries had left hundreds of thousands of Greek civilians destitute and hungry, Jarvis, Howe, and Miller became heroes in a different way. Working with Philhellene activists in America and using their growing celebrity status, they pleaded with the American public for money and provisions to relieve the suffering of the Greek citizens. The public, and especially American women, responded beyond anyone's expectations. They contributed personally, organized countless fundraising events, from balls to knitting circles, and eventually sent more than a dozen cargo ships filled with relief supplies to Greece. Knowing that Greek militia leaders would steal the supplies, and having standing with those leaders because they had fought themselves, Jarvis, Howe, and Miller then, with their muskets at the ready, personally delivered the relief to tens of thousands of starving Greek civilians, a feat that is still remembered in Greece today with awe and gratitude. While most Americans have no memory of this country's involvement, the experience arguably had more lasting impact here in America than in Greece. As the historian Maureen Connors-Santelli details in her new book, Greek Fire, charitable drives for Greece provided American women with their first ever opportunity to be publicly involved in foreign affairs, and thus fed a nascent women's rights movement. Indeed, some early feminist leaders were prominent Philhellenes, including the educator Emma Willard, who sent teachers to Greece to establish schools there after the war. Santelli further documents how widespread public empathy for the Greeks living under Turkish oppression also led over the course of the war to a more open questioning of American enslavement of Black Americans. Indeed, the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison originally contemplated going to fight in Greece before deciding to do battle against slavery in America as a journalist and a newspaper publisher, writing at one point that rebellious Southern slaves, quote, deserve no more censure than the Greeks, end quote. Some of the Americans who did actually journey abroad to fight returned home to become noted anti-slavery crusaders, including Howe. The stirring of national conscience that resulted from debate over the war was so profound that the abolitionist Frederick Benjamin Sanborn would later say that the eventual ending of slavery in the US had, quote, begun in Greece, end quote. The world is obviously vastly different today than it was 2 centuries ago. America was then a young and rising nation with growing prosperity and equality, at least for white men. Europe was in the grip of reactionary tyranny, from which the United States wisely sought to isolate itself. Today, both the US and the nations of Europe are democracies, enmeshed with each other in alliances like NATO that have kept the peace and protected their freedoms for nearly 3/4 of a century. But both are also suffering from growing inequality and downward mobility. Still, the parallels between the 1820s and the 2020s are worth paying attention to. Now as then, authoritarianism is on the march. According to the latest assessment from Freedom House, democracy has been in worldwide decline for 15 straight years, including here in the United States in recent years, thanks in no small part to authoritarian meddling by Russia and China. The need to balance the demands of principle and practicality in foreign affairs is as great now as it was 200 years ago, if not greater. Joe Biden will have to find the balance as he negotiates not just Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but China's continuing genocide against the Uyghurs and the increasing authoritarianism and provocations of Turkey's neo-Ottoman leader, Recep Erdogan. On that point, the story of the US involvement with the Greek War of Independence is especially instructive. In ways no one could have foreseen, America's engagement in that fight accelerated necessary confrontations with our own society's wrongs. That same dynamic played out in later conflicts too. The need for mass mobilization in World War II compelled the US government to integrate white ethnic communities, including Greeks, into the mainstream culture. The need to counter Soviet propaganda during the Cold War opened the way to civil rights advances for Black Americans. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is only weeks old, and we do not know how it will end or what role Western countries will or will not play in that ending. We do know, however, how the Greek War of Independence ended as a victory for the Greek people, achieved through their enormous sacrifices of blood and treasure, but with vital assistance from the Western powers whose navies sank the Turkish fleet in Navarino Bay in 1827. And we can say with some certainty, based on the American experience of the Greek War of Independence and all the conflicts that have happened since, that our involvement in the war in Ukraine will change us. Let us hope it is for the better. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Glastris, for such an illuminating and moving presentation. We are so grateful for your presence with us today, shedding more light to our history, which has so much to teach us. We continue with a dedication to the Greek woman by a beloved member of our community, board member of Prometheus, Professor Ismini Lamb. Professor Lamb is the director of Modern Greek Studies program at Georgetown University, the oldest sustained such program in America. She is the authorized biographer of George Horton, the American consul in Smyrna in 1922. Horton was a Philhellene, classicist, poet, best-selling author, diplomat, and ethnographer. The biography demonstrates Horton was a humanitarian who helped Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike, and a reliable witness to history. The book is entitled The Gentle American, George Horton's Odyssey, and it will be available this summer before Smyrna's centennial remembrances. Today, Professor Lamb is offering us a dedication to Greek women heroes in the Greek War of Independence. Dear Professor Lamb, the floor is yours.
Good evening. As we celebrate today the 201st anniversary of Greek independence, we pay tribute to the known and unknown women who fought for freedom. Women like the two powerful ladies of courage and determination, Bouboulina and Mandou Mavrogenous, who gave everything for the Greek Revolution. Bouboulina became a Greek naval commander, and on March 13, 1821, she raised a flag on her ship similar to that of the Komnenos dynasty of Byzantine emperors, and she led her fleet of 8 ships to Nafplio where she began a naval blockade. Manto, another female patriot, was a well-educated Hellene who not only fought, but convinced her wealthy friends as far away as Paris to donate money for better weaponry for the Greeks fighting in the revolution. She herself died in penury after sacrificing all her wealth on the altar of freedom. Then there were women like the Suliotises. Like Spartan women of old, they were trained to use weapons. During the war, they took up their armor and fought with bravery against the terrible Turk. Two of these women, Mosco Zavela and Haido Yanaki Sehu, took part in the military operations and even threw boulders off of high cliffs to smash into the Turks below during the battles. In December of 1803, at the dance of Zalogo, the same women threw themselves off the high cliffs where they had previously thrown rocks from, preferring to commit suicide rather than be captured and dishonored by the Turks. Incidentally, the dance of Zalogo was immortalized in history by a Turkish writer, Ibrahim Manzur Effendi, who heard the story from a Turkish army officer who witnessed the dance. He wrote that the women held hands and danced as one by one, and they threw their children from the cliffs of Zalogo before jumping after them themselves. The fervency and dedication of these women was talked about throughout Europe, and they became a symbol of self-sacrifice for Greece and for freedom. There were also lesser-known martyrs recorded in folk songs who deserve remembrance, like the 200 women and girls who fell from a cliff at Riniasa in Suli and in Nausa at the falls of Arapitsa. Also, how can we forget the tragic heroines of Messolongi? The women of Messolongi, the Messolongitises, not only defended Western Greece throughout the long siege of the area, they also helped the soldiers by transporting materials such as wood and tools, and even caring for the wounded. During the mass exodus from their surrounded city, many of the women of Messolongi perished alongside the soldiers as they were massacred, captured, or committed suicide to escape further torture at the hands of their enemy. Nor can we overlook the glorious women of Mani, like the immortal Drepanophores Maniatises, who, following in the footsteps of their ancient Spartan forebears, repeated their famous cry of freedom, Itan I epitas, either victorious or dead on your shield. The Maniatises were working in the fields when Ibrahim's army arrived, threatening everything they held dear. They grabbed whatever they could and fought, using their sickles, rocks, and wood. They fought fearlessly, like Amazons, until Ibrahim's Turco-Egyptian army retreated, unable to ever enslave the free hearts of the Maniots. And then there is Asimo Gura, perhaps my favorite heroine. She's the famous defender of the Acropolis, known as the daughter of the Acropolis. In his famous painting of her, Nicolas Gosse depicts her symbolically as an allegory of Greece fighting for freedom and salvation. After her husband's death during the 1826 siege of the Acropolis by Kütahya, Asimo assumed command of the besieged Greek forces and fought bravely. Gosse has her standing dauntless, even imperious, holding her sword high, avenging not only her husband's death, but the honor of her land. Standing in the middle of the ancient temple, she's stepping on the enemy's symbols of destruction, the half moon and the scimitar. Asimo is the incarnation of the eternal defender of Greece against the unspeakable Turk. She symbolizes the climactic battle between Western freedom and Oriental despotism. The Greek women fighters like Manto, Bouboulina, the Maniatises, the Suliotises, the Messolongitises, and women like Gura inspired and galvanized all the other women in 1821, most of whose names are unknown and unrecorded. The everyday mother, daughter, wife, sister, and friend, Some, like Panorea Hadzikostadi, the Psorokostena, can be found by the diligent researcher. According to folk tradition, Panorea was the wife of a merchant from Asia Minor in Kidonies. One day, the Ottomans killed her husband and took her 4 children, but she escaped and went to Nafplio, where she became a beggar. A scholar tells us that with the money she collected from begging, she would feed and care for the orphans from the war in the Peloponnese. She gave whatever was most valuable to her, her love and care, even her silver wedding ring, for those orphans and the liberation of Greece. All these legendary heroines, whether known and unknown, inspired and lead the way for generations of future Greek heroines like Lela Karagianni and Electra Apostolou, who resisted and fought against the Nazi occupation of Greece in World War II. We owe it to them and to our sons and daughters to remember these heroines and to let them inspire us today and in the future, filling us with awe and gratitude for their sacrifice. Χρόνια πολλά και ζήτω η Ελλάδα.
Thank you, Professor Lam, Dioris Mini, for sharing with us this dedication to the women of the Greek War of Independence. We continue with a poem dedicated to Dionysios Solomos, composed by Dimitris Papaditsas, recited by Mr. Periklis Tabekis, and this will be followed by music and dances from Kalymnos, performed by the Greek Dancers Group, who are students of St. George Greek School in Bethesda, Maryland. Enjoy.
Διονύσιος Σολομός, ένα ποίημα του Δημήτρη Παπαδίτσα. Για τον Διονύσιο Σολομό, τι έχω να πω. Απογείρει και ανθούσει κάθε λέξη του και φως και ονειροπύλης της λευτεριάς στο ουράνιο πανηγύρι, όπου χορέψαν οι έρωτες με τον ξανθόν Απρίλη. Ποιος έστειλε και ποιας θεάς το γάλα έχει σβιζάξει, που απ' της Τουρκιάς τα σίδερα μια νύχτα είχε λυθεί. Μεγάλε μας έμαθες πως η αρμονία και η τάξη αστράψαν μέσα στη σκλαβιά σαν δίκοπο σπαθί.
Dear friends, thank you for joining us on this Greek Independence Day 2022. Ζήτω η 25η Μαρτίου. Ζήτω η Ελλάδα. Happy Greek Independence Day. Hope to see you again next year. Good evening.